All right, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at creating models. But of course, one more thing. Let's talk about some best practices here. If we review, what we're doing, we need to understand what we're doing and why before we start to really pick up the pace here. Again, this is the target architecture we're looking for, where we have our source and our analytics dev, our raw and analytics dev, and we're going to have these different schemas within it. But we want to make sure that we're building our project with this in mind. We're not just, blindly building some DBT project where we don't know what we're doing. So here's a couple tips and things I would recommend and how we're going to approach this as we move forward. One, consistent naming conventions. I think if you've worked in data or really anything in a corporate world, you know that naming is so important. Things can get really out of hand quickly if you're not careful. So what we're going to do for our naming is use different prefixes. So for example, we've already touched on the sources. We'll do a src underscore and then the schema. For our staging layer, we'll do, so everything in here, those models will be built with stg underscore, the name of the schema, 2 underscores, and the name of the table. This might seem redundant, but we'll talk about why I think that's important in a little bit. For the warehouse, we'll have our dimensions and our facts prefix with dim and fact, and then reporting rpt underscore. This is a bit arbitrary. It's whatever you want to do, but I do think that having these prefixes is really helpful. All of your models do need to be unique in name. So the SQL files, they have to be unique in DBT. And this is one way to ensure that that happens because, this should, for the most part, always be unique. So you won't run into that problem. It's just helpful because you'll know where things are, how to find it, and exactly what that model represents just by looking at it. You don't have to take a guess to what it is. Second here is create a staging layer, which we're going to do. We've mentioned we're going to create a staging layer. What I mean by that is this should really be a representation of your source tables in your DBT project and further on. They'll typically be a view, and it's more of creating source-centric transformations on top of your raw source table. So you're renaming things once, data type casting, but it's on the source level. So you rename something however it needs to be named for the rest of the project. You don't need to rename it in every single layer later on. So that's a big part. There's a lot of great benefits to that. So creating a staging layer is something we'll do as well. The next one here is creating a schema.yaml file for each directory, or it could be by model if you have too many. And this will be similar to our sources YAML, but instead of being sources, it's going to say model. And we can give descriptions and all sorts of stuff for describing and adding tests. All this stuff, as we'll see, for any models, not a source, but a model. It's kind of the same function, but for just a different concept in DBT. So we'll have one for each directory in our case. So we'll have 1, 2, 3 of those. And the last two here are just kind of general thoughts. One is be explicit. And there was this really great phrase that was offered in one of the DBT trainings I attended, which was new lines are cheap, brain power is expensive. And what that means is be explicit. Don't try to be overly, tricky with what you're doing, because other people after you will have to come in and read your code and interpret it. And you don't want it to be longer to interpret than to make a change, So that not only applies to the code that you write, but to the spacing. Give yourself some room, make sure it's clean. You want it to be easy to work with, maintainability, remember that viewpoint, as well as with the naming. So it all kind of comes together. I think this sums it up nicely to basically say, be organized, be clean, and it'll make maintainability much, much better. And lastly, align your DBT directories with your target database. Like we said, we're going to do that here as well. So let's make sure we're doing that in our DBT project. So the last thing here, just to kind of put it all together, we have sources here that are going to be prefixed with source. We have our models. We'll have our 3 directories, and each table within those, or each model, will be prefixed with this way. All right. So I'm going to stop this video here. So that we can just kind of end on that point. And then in the next video, we're going to start building these models out and moving a little quicker in building our project.